Order, and welcome to today's session of the Justice Select Committee, which is the first public hearing of our inquiry into rehabilitation and resettlement. And we are very pleased to have a very distinguished panel to interrogate, learn from today. I'll ask them to introduce themselves, but before we do that, we, as usual, will do our declarations of the members' interests, starting with Mike Tapp.
Hello, Mike Tapp. My only interest in the past is working for the National Crime Agency.
Hello, Sarah Russell. Interest as per the register. I'm also a member of Usdaw and Community Trade Unions, and I'm a solicitor by background.
My name's Tessa Munt. The only thing I would say is that I'm a director of Whistleblowers UK, which is a non-profit making organisation.
Ashley Fox, interests as per the register.
Annie Slaughter, I'm the chair of the committee. I'm a non-practising barrister. I'm the patron of two justice-related organisations, Houses and From Law Centre and the Upper Room, and I'm a member of the Unite and GMB trade unions.
Good afternoon. My name is Lindsay Farnsworth, and I am a non-practising solicitor formerly of the Crown Prosecution Service, and I'm a member of a number of unions, including the FDA.
Good afternoon, I'm Pam Cox. I'm the MP for Colchester. Interests are declared on the register. I was previously a Professor of Criminal Justice Studies, Sociology at the University of Essex.
Hello, good afternoon. I'm Winder Jess, Member of Parliament in Wolverhampton West. I'm an Executive Council member of the GMB Trade Union. I'm a solicitor and I'm also a member of various APPGs here.
Thank you very much, everyone. And would the five guests just wish to introduce themselves? We'll start with Jess.
Thanks. I'm Jess Mullen. I'm the Chief Executive of the Alliance for Youth Justice, and we're an alliance of 80 non-profit organisations working to drive improvements in the youth justice system.
I'm Nicola Drinkwater. I'm Director of External Affairs and Campaigns at Women in Prison. So we work and have presence across 9 of the women's prisons in England, and we deliver services to women in their communities in Manchester, London and Surrey. And we also hold the Secretariat for the APPG for women affected by the justice system.
Hello everyone, my name is Sinha. I'm the Chief Exec of the Prison Reform Trust. Prison Reform Trust is a charity that fights for and advocates for a just and fair and humane prison system. Our aims are about not only looking at who comes into prison and for how long, but also the conditions that prisoners find themselves in and their families outside. Prior to joining PRT, I was in the prison service for 24 years. I started as a psychologist and governed 3 prisons. My last role in HMPPS was Director of Women. And I came and joined PRT in April 23.
I'm Anne Fox. I'm the Chief Exec of Clinks, the infrastructure charity for charities and social enterprises working with people in the justice system across England and Wales. We are a 26-year-old organisation. I've been with the organisation for 9 years, and we work with the sector, which is about 1,700 specialist charities and 17,000 charities that work with people with needs that are very prevalent in the justice system. It's a pleasure to be here.
Hi, I'm Helen Berresford. I'm the Director of External Engagement at the charity Nacro. We're a charity which delivers services across England and Wales, from education, housing, health and wellbeing and justice services. We support around 28,000 people every year. In our justice services, they range from commissioned rehabilitative services to the CAS 2 service and also criminal record advice service.
Thank you very much. If I may start with a few questions. What I think essentially we're trying to get out of this session is to find out what should be, how mechanisms for rehabilitation resettlement should be working, areas in which they're not, and how you would want to see improvement. So could we start by scene setting? I don't mind who answers this. As we understand it, the national regime model is what currently governs, is the benchmark for how prisoners should be treated, and that's only been in effect for about a year. Could you just explain a bit more about what that is and say how you think it's working?
Shall I start?
Yes, please.
Yeah. So the national regime model is, I think it's been in operation for about a year, so it's fairly new. And it has it's divided up the expectations from prisons into three main parts. One is what's called the foundation work that prisons need to do, which is mandated, and that includes each prison needing to provide 120 minutes or 2 hours of time out of cell in each prison, and that's the minimum expectation that each prison should provide. That includes an increase of the time that people get access to fresh air. It used to be 30 to 45 minutes. It's now mandated that it should be an hour, and that the other hour needs to include domestics, which are showers, etc., opportunities to contact family members, so phone calls, and that's the foundation section. And then you have Tier 1 activities and then Tier 2 activities. Tier 1 activities are mainly linked with, I've got a list here of things, if I may read them out for you. Opportunities for physical education, so that's going to the gym, access to corporate worship, receiving social visits from loved ones, key work, which is the opportunity for them to access their offender manager or the prison offender manager and do key work, any rehabilitation work, and work that enhances their contact with their families. And that's Tier 1. So it includes education, it includes access to industries, it includes interventions like offending behaviour programs, and it includes access to clinics and health promotion. Tier 2 activities are much more linked with structured wing activities. They include things like peer support. This is prisoners who are employed to provide support to other prisoners. It could include in-cell activities, so work that people can do inside their cells when they're not out. It can include GPs giving social prescribing activities, and it's essentially it's about enhancement and enrichment. So the first one is for offending behaviour programs. The second one is much more for enrichment.
I'm not sure I'm following the timings here, so maybe you can enlighten us. The 2 hours, 120 minutes, includes an hour outside, so that's included in those 2 hours. Is the tier activity also included in those 2 hours? So that's additional.
It's additional.
But there's no minimum specified for that, no minimum.
Tiering. So the way that the new regime model works is that it gives a lot more flexibility to governors and their senior leaders to decide what the purpose of that prison is and what proportion of activity needs to be dedicated to what activity. So in local prisons where you have a lot of churn, prisoners coming in and out, you might not have the opportunity to do offending behaviour programs. They are much more of a focus for Category B, Category C prisons, where prisoners spend a larger proportion of their time and therefore have the opportunity to access these types of interventions. So there's flexibility in the plan that you create, but every prison, every adult prison needs to have the foundation lane as a minimum.
There's no, 2 hours is a pretty de minimis level. But my two questions are, is it monitored which prisons do and don't meet that? Because I think we've heard, anecdotally at least, that some don't even meet the 2 hours. And then, even assuming they do, and assuming you've got all this very sort of worthy list of things they could be doing, we've got no idea whether they are actually doing them, or if so, if they're doing them for 10 minutes or 5 hours.
Right.
So
they ought to be measured and monitored, and it's a performance metric. But what we're hearing anecdotally from the ground is that even the delivery of the foundation work is not happening with regularity or consistency.
So in principle, the national regime model is really positive. You know, it very much is well in terms of people who come into prison facing a lot of challenges, who are going to need a lot of support in order not to reoffend and come back to prison. The principle is that those people would access Tier 2 interventions, and that's often where the voluntary sector will really come in as well. So what a prison has to do, the model is a framework model and a template, and then each prison should devise its regime based on the overall population needs, particularly the Tier 1, And then with tier 2, they can go down into the bespoke needs of individuals within a prison. So you might think, well, this is a prison where we have a lot of people who are drug dependent. We're going to get additional services. We have a lot of people who are a very long way from their home and from their family. And also, although it doesn't apply in children's prisons, it does apply in women's prisons and men's prisons. So in prisons for women, you could get more of a bespoke model, although there isn't a different model regime. The central development of the model was quite good. They worked with us at Clinks. We did a special interest group right across voluntary sector, organisations that work in all sorts of places with all sorts of expertise. But I think in practice, it was brought in at a really difficult time. It's probably right. So they recovered into reform was the kind of COVID language. So instead of going back to normal, which wasn't very good, they went back into a reform programme when the restrictions for COVID lifted. But as a result, it wasn't a perfect place to start. And there was a lot of other changes happening, and a lot of the pre-existing pressures in the system were still there. So all the issues you hear time and again about staffing, lack of sufficiency, lack of skilled and experienced staff. So the process got rushed, and in a lot of areas, we've heard from our members and organisations up and down the country, the prisons have said, we'll just do this first one and then we'll come back and next year we'll try and do something different. And it hasn't been resourced additionally. So you've got your kind of, I'm sure we'll get into contracting and commissioning later, but you've got those models, but within the regime model and developing your regime annual plan and your quarterly review, you don't have any additional resource for that.
We're not talking about the quality of provision yet. We're talking about just whether it is there, whether the boxes are ticked, if you like. Is that information that you have available to you, or could we get that information by prison and say this prison is meeting its 120 minutes or is meeting its tier 1 or 2?
Well, it should be, because they set out the plan every year of what their regime is going to be, and then that's kind of itself metrics, isn't it? And then there's a quarterly review on that. So, yeah, that information should be there.
Should be available. Yeah.
Yeah.
And in your experience, is it generally, it's 120 minutes being kept to in most cases now? No. Okay. Sorry,
just to recap and refresh. So there's a national regime, which is broadly, you think, positive. Requires 2 hours of that kind of activity we've just talked about, in 2 hours out of cell, including an hour outside, but it's not being delivered on the whole across the estate.
That's what we're hearing.
Okay, thank you.
Mike.
Thank you. I have this question lined up for later, but actually it's appropriate now, I think. In terms of time out of cell, what's your opinions, given your knowledge on how that should look in terms of time and activity?
Well, I mean, time out of cell, it was broader, so I think that breaking it down into tiers is helpful, so that governors can have flexibility to say, well, in this prison we need more of this activity, and that makes it easier to plan. The mandating that you get an hour as opposed to half an hour, 3/4 of an hour is again welcome, because it's more time. Most adult male prisons, closed prisons, now have in-cell telephony, which makes contact easier. It used to be that when time out of cell included the opportunity to make your phone calls, a lot of time was wasted queuing up for phones, and they were public. So with the inclusion of in-cell telephony, that will actually make a difference. The problem around showers is still a problem. So if you are saying that in that hour that people have, they have to get their showers done, it's sometimes not always possible. And I think those times, if they're not regularly given to individuals, what we're hearing is that showers become the first thing that go by the wayside. The infrastructure of prisons is really poor at the moment, so showers are broken, they're in a bad state of repair. So what is in reality being delivered, and the quality of that is something that we need to also look at in context in terms of whether it's being delivered properly.
So progress has been made. Do you think...
In theory.
In theory. Do you think there should be longer? or do you think it's about right?
I think there needs to be longer, particularly at the moment with the fact that, with the exception of some prisons, there's very little in your cell. So you need to come out of your cell to do anything apart from make a phone call and maybe use the toilet. So you will need to come out of your cell. So with investments in technology, we don't want to see people locked up, but the necessity of coming out of your cell to do anything that is needed for your rehabilitation means that people will need to have longer out.
Yeah. And also you are overcrowded. So that causes a slowing down of the process, because you need to have the right ratio of staff to prisoner. So as our prisons are so badly overcrowded, the number of people can come out to do even basic things is severely restricted.
Yeah, thank you.
Sarah, do you want to come in briefly? No, you want to move on. Yes.
Yeah, you mentioned that showers are one of the first thing that goes by the wayside. Now, most of us would think that was quite a fundamental and basic thing. And certainly one of the prisons that we have spoken to someone at had a significant problem with washing machines as well. So I was wondering what your view is of the levels of hygiene available to female prisoners.
I can speak to that. And I would say that women aren't able to leave their cells as much as we'd like to see. So a recent HMI inspection report found that men and women were spending sometimes up to 22 hours a day in their cells. We see women that we're working with, sometimes they can't access underwear, they can't access trousers. A woman we were working with had a towel around her because she didn't have access to the clothes that she needed. There are women who might have been arrested in the summer and then they go outside in the winter and they don't have a coat and they're freezing and there's nothing that's done to respond to that. It's really challenging for women to access their basic needs and what they need to survive and what they need in prison. Some of that is down to staffing and the availability of staff for them to be able to leave their cells, but some of it is just the way that the prisons are operating that mean it's really challenging to be able to access your basic rights. And I think if we come back to the focus of the session and the inquiry focus on rehabilitation, if women can't access the basic rights that they need, then how on earth are we going to set them up to rehabilitate and reintegrate into society? The situation in prisons for women is really, really challenging at the moment, and we're really concerned about what we're seeing.
May I add to the women's issue? Because the size of the population is so much smaller, in the male estate you have prison industry that makes boxer shorts and PE kit and basic clothes that can provide clothes to the male estate. In the women's estate, it doesn't attract that industry because they're too small, and often governors have to go out and purchase underwear and bras for women. Women come into their prisons without any appropriate clothing, and so those basic fundamental things are lacking in the women's estate. That's not felt in the adult male estate.
Okay.
Just very briefly on that point, is there any suggestion, information or evidence to suggest that has a negative impact on mental health? Because I'm thinking that would then have a knock-on effect with rehabilitation. Would you say that's fair?
Yes, I mean, I would say that, if we're looking at a trauma-informed model, a large proportion of women who drift into custody have histories of domestic and sexual physical violence. When you're in an environment where your basic needs, your basic bespoke feminine needs are not addressed, it's very triggering of your trauma. And I think that when you are in that state, addressing any of your rehabilitation needs becomes severely challenged.
Yeah, and I agree, and I'll add to that. We see the self-harm rates in women's prisons are incredibly high. So at the moment, they're about 8 times higher than in the male estate. I think at least 1 in 3 women is self-harming in prisons. And if you look at the numbers on remand, that number is a lot higher. And I mean, I completely agree with Pia. Women often experience domestic violence and abuse. Around 60% of women in contact with the justice system have those experiences. Prison is often an incredibly traumatising environment, and we find that women are self-harming for lots of different reasons, often because they're very unwell. But it's sometimes in response to the challenging environment that they're in. They can't leave their cells, they can't access what they need. And we're also using prison as a place of safety. So some women are sent to prison because they're so unwell, but there isn't mental health provision in the community for them. So they really need psychiatric care, but they're not able to access that, and they're sent to prison. So we've got a very unwell population, and because of some of the resource challenges and the staffing challenges, it kind of adds to that picture that we're seeing. And then, as I've mentioned, women are self-harming, and it does absolutely impact their mental health.
Sarah, then Tessa.
There are so many questions. But do women, from your description, it sounds like women are lacking a lot of things that you would take for granted as a woman in the outside world, and the first thing that springs to mind there then is menstrual products. Do women have access to the menstrual products they need?
It's hit and miss. I think that, there is, supply is there, but often they may not have access to them in their cells. They might have to get attention of officers. And we know as women it's highly embarrassing and humiliating to have to press your emergency cell bell and perhaps ask a male officer to provide you with sanitary products. And women often don't know their rights. They don't know what they can and can't ask for. So the supply is there, but often their access to it may be limited.
Charities and social enterprises working in prisons often spend quite a lot of money on basic things that people need in terms of hygiene, bars of soap, toothpaste, deodorants, because the price of the things that you can buy as well in the canteen in prison are completely overinflated. Like, you'd never see the price of these things. They're just really, really expensive and out of a lot of people's reach. Then if you add to that people's cultural needs, so we have a lot of organisations that get money from the public, get mainly money from charitable organisations to then go in and purchase things, particularly for times like resettlement, when you won't be given things because you're leaving, and yet you'll leave with nothing.
Thank you very much indeed. I noticed the Ministry of Justice said that each women's prison has a bespoke regime design aligned to the needs of women. It sounds slightly questionable, bearing in mind what you've been saying. And I just wondered what the regime looks like for women particularly, as opposed to men. We've been talking about the general estate, and how is it bespoke? And I assume that it's in no way bespoke to individual women. It is women as a generality.
The model is the model, and so it's this tier 1 and tier 2, yes. Which isn't necessarily of itself trauma informed, and that's where you would start with a regime for women's prisons, and certainly where you would start with a regime that's in any way personalised. But so the basics of what have to be in the prison is for everybody. And in a way, it's kind of similar to maybe what was done about 15 years ago in kind of health visiting and children's centres, where you had this universal offer and then you have this tailored offer. So the idea then that the prison looks at who it has in terms of its population. And that will be general. It's because we will take people who are going to be here for a long period of time, a closed women's prison or an open women's prison. For example, Eastwood Park in Gloucestershire knows it's going to have women from Wales, as is Style, so they'll be thinking about what they need in their prison, but it isn't personally based on this woman is here and this is what she is going to get. But the model should allow for that flexibility. But overall, I think that the intent and certainly the pressure from the voluntary sector is that women's prisons should be trauma-informed and trauma-responsive.
And what capacity, what facility is there? How much trauma-informed practice is there across the women's estate?
I think it's definitely mixed, and I do have quite big questions about how trauma-informed a women's prison can really be. If you're there, the deprivation of your liberty, and also as we've outlined, the situation is really challenging at the moment. So women say to us, walking into a prison feels like walking into asylum. I can hear women banging.
Speak up a little bit.
Yeah, of course, sorry. Women say to us, it feels like walking into an asylum, and I can hear women banging their heads against the wall, screaming for help. The situation is so challenging at the moment. It's really difficult. That's not a trauma-informed environment. That's a really challenging environment to be in, and especially considering the experiences of women before they even came into the justice system. there's definitely moves to make women's prisons more trauma informed, and you can see that with some of the training that might be offered to prison staff, for example, and the way that
I just asked, you say offered to the prison staff.
Yeah, so
not delivered.
I think some of the challenges we have at the moment, and I think this has been impacted, it's a bit of a hangover, I'd say, from COVID-19, where there was a lot of churn with staff. So we've got quite a lot of new staff in post, and some of the women that we're working with in prison are quite concerned about the ability of staff to take care of them, because often they might haven't been trained. They will have received training, but they're quite new in post. And so, as an example, one of the women that we're working with told us where there was a woman who had a fit in prison, and staff didn't know what to do, and they froze. And it was the other women that had to call for help. They put her in the recovery position, and it's because staff, they're quite new. And it's a challenging environment to work in. So I struggle a bit with the question around a trauma-informed environment, because women's prisons are so far from that at the moment. It's quite challenging to see how we could get there in the short term. I think in the long term, there are definitely opportunities to look at through the Women's Justice Board and the sentencing review, really who needs to be in women's prisons, and absolutely support the government's recognition that most women really don't need to be in prison and they can be supported well in their communities. So focusing on how we can get to that picture would be, I suppose, more preferable, and then we can think about what really needs to happen in the small cases where women should be in a secure environment.
I couldn't agree more, because really what we know is there are models, and there are training programs, and there's space for these things to happen if we significantly reduce the number of people and the number of people whose needs cannot be met in a prison and need to be met elsewhere. I'd also kind of commend to the committee, one of our members, the Prison Radio Association, has a podcast called The Secret Life of Prisons, and this week's episode is really, really very telling about diagnosis of mental health issues, and how people actually can, the first time they get decent support is in a place actually that's just not really right for people who are very mentally unwell.
I'm going to go slightly off brief, but I'm very interested to know that, I would have thought that actually one of you was saying the example of a woman who was fitting, and I would have thought it was absolutely fundamental, basic training. Firstly, basic training for any officer, and then secondly, when somebody comes into a prison where you might know that they have a history of a particular medical condition or a situation, that there would be information passed on to the wing or wherever, so that the appropriate support is there and people know what might happen to any particular prisoner. Am I being terribly idealistic?
No, I don't think you are. I think that, and there was bespoke training for staff who were going to work or were expressed a desire to work in the women's estate.
Is not trauma-informed practice basic? I am being naive.
I think that the women's, so the training for prison staff, new prison staff, who are going to work in the women's estate, they added an additional couple of weeks, I think, to the training so that they could get some bespoke training on what the specific needs of women might be. However, those training sessions are not filled up enough, and that training is not happening as it should. So most of the people that come to work in the women's estate have just received generic prison officer training as opposed to specific specialist prison officer training to work in the women's estate.
Share about this afterwards rather than diverting the process now, but thank you very much. Can I move on to young offenders? And I wondered how the regime model differed for young offenders.
So the national regime model is only applies to the adult estate. In the youth estate, there are 4 different types of establishment. So children can be held in custody in secure children's homes, the secure schools, secure training centres, and youth offending institutions. And the regimes between those different establishments vary. There's a number of documents that set out the regime, the YOI rules, the STC rules, Prison Service Instruction 08. So there's a number of different documents, but the key difference I'd say, between the youth estate and the adult estate, at least in theory, is that the purpose, it's set out in statute that the purpose of the youth justice system is to prevent offending, and by extension, that's the purpose of those secure establishments as well. And children, in theory, should be getting at least 15 hours of formal education a week, plus a range of other enrichment activities that constitute purposeful
That's across
activity.
all four types?
Yeah, that's across all four. There's no minimum time out of cell in YOIs and STCs where there are cells. Each establishment sets a target for that themselves. And also across... Sorry.
Set a target?
Yes.
So they set their own rules?
For time out of cell. There's no minimum set in statute.
Okay.
I mean, obviously, the 15 hours of education a week is a minimum, but then beyond
that's
that...
set in stone?
That's set in stone.
But time, being a human,
yes,
is not?
No.
And yet this is focused on rehabilitation?
Yes. And of course, we're talking about children. What I would say is the difference in terms of the types of establishment are young offenders institutions are the ones that are closest to adult prisons. So you'll see differences in things like the ratios of staff to children. There are greater numbers of staff to children in secure children's homes and the secure school. And then it goes up a bit in the secure training centre and then again to the youth offending institutions. There's differences in the numbers of children in the establishment and the size of the establishment, with, again, youth offending institutions being the largest. And there are differences in terms of whether children are allowed to wear their own clothes and their access to the number of visits. And there are also differences in use of force. So in a secure children's home, staff are permitted to restrain children to prevent serious damage to property or people. But in a young offenders institute, restraint can be used when prison rules are contravened and when there's disorder.
Can I ask then, seeing as how they're set up to stop reoffending, which of those models is most successful?
Well, I suppose the first thing to say is that even that, in theory, that I've just said, isn't happening in practice.
Yes.
And at the moment, the majority of children are held in young offenders institutes, and they are characterised by really, really high levels of violence at the moment.
I missed that second.
They're characterised by incredibly high levels of violence at the moment. So what we're seeing is really debilitating levels of violence and self-harm. We've seen in the last recent period, we've seen stun grenades used against children, guard dogs. So we've got really, really serious issues. And what's happening is they're having to implement keep-apart lists, which essentially lists of children who can't physically be in the same space together. And what that's doing is it's hugely affecting the purposeful activity that children have access to in the education. So the inspectorate have highlighted that children are essentially in groups for education, not based on their learning needs, but based on which other children they can safely associate with. So to answer your question of which is the most effective model, our view very much is that the evidence base shows that children need to be in small units. Behaviour management is facilitated by small units where adults can form trusting relationships with children, where those units can be welfare-based and rights-respecting, very much utilising staff that aren't prison officers. So secure children's homes are the closest we have as a model to that evidence base currently. And we really hope that the current government will reiterate the previous government's commitment to closing youth offending institutions and the remaining secure training college. But we're yet to see the government do that. And what we would hope is then for them to go further and really set out a plan for how we actually get there and get to a place where we can close those institutions and have children in those more appropriate settings.
Thank you. I know. I can feel the heat. Let me finish.
Okay.
I'm not clear in my own mind. Is there a different regime for male and for female young offenders?
So, girls previously were held in Rainsborough Secure Training Centre, which was closed due to essentially the inspectorate reporting that there was just incredibly high uses of segregation. And as a result, since then, there is no dedicated establishment for girls. So our view is that girls in the system should be in secure children's homes. The girls who are in the system currently are incredibly vulnerable, very, very high levels of vulnerability. And we have a very perverse situation where secure children's homes aren't run by the youth custody service, and they can refuse the placement, and often on good grounds, because they feel that they can't meet that person's needs, or that they will affect the needs of another child in their care. But what that's leading to is a situation where the establishments that are least able to meet the needs of those girls are where those girls are ending up being placed. So the girls currently, there was a period of time where they were in a youth offending institution. As I understand it, they're currently not. They're in the last remaining secure training centre, was the last I heard, and I think there's one girl in the secure school. But the levels of vulnerability most certainly indicate that they should be in secure children's homes. And the review that is taking place at the moment, we've had good engagement with that review, and I think it has a good grasp of the issues, and we look forward to its recommendations and think that from what we've heard, they will be positive, and we look forward to seeing the government take those forward.
Generally, though, can I just thank you for what you've said? That's really helpful. Male young offenders and female young offenders have different regimes. No, they're all shoved in together. They
won't be accommodated in the same space, but in terms of the regimes and what they receive, it's the same. I mean, in the current situation, there is very little differentiation happening. In fact, probably close to none differentiation happening in terms of response to the needs of children and young people, because, as I said, the inspectorate have found that actually children are in education just based on who they can be with. So we're in a situation where trying to differentiate regimes to meet needs is just not happening at all.
And Sky. I let the heat...
Well, you can, but I had Mike indicating first and then...
Very good.
Thank you. I just want to go into the detail of what a day looks like a little bit more, if you don't mind. So you say there's 15 hours education, assume that's 5 days, sort of 3 hours a day. Is there additional time for those sort of tier 1, tier 2 type activities on top of that?
So yeah, it's not classed as tier 1 and tier 2 in the youth estate, but there should be, in theory, additional access to enrichment activities, whether that be time outside, physical education, youth work, might be music or arts. Yeah, there should be additional provision.
Is that standardised?
No.
No. And is it monitored?
I think it's standardised. I need to double check. I think through the education contracts, I think there's like an additional, these are the things that could be provided in addition. My understanding is they're not necessarily quantified and set out that clearly.
And then final question. You say there's high levels of violence. Is there different categories within the prisons and divisions depending on what they're in for?
In the youth estate, no. The numbers are so small that there tends not to be that level of differentiation.
Thank you.
Sarah?
We are signatories to the United Nations Convention on the Rights of the Child. You have described a situation in which it's not clear to me that children are necessarily leaving their cells during the daytime at all. You specifically talked about there being a 15-hour-a-week education target. Is part of that target that education has to be provided outside of the cell, or is there, because I know certainly in some of the adult estate people are accessing education on iPads within their cells, so I'm just wondering, is the education provision synonymous with leaving your cell, or is it not necessarily? And are there any physical, like any actually being outdoors targets at all? Is what you're saying that there's no guarantee that these children ever get to go outdoors?
So there is a minimum amount of exercise and being outdoors. There is that, but you're absolutely right about the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child and access to that purposeful activity. So HMI Prism reported in October a considerable deterioration over the last 10 years in the amount of time out of cell and access to purposeful activity and access to education and the quality of it. And in 23-24, they found that provision was not good enough across all youth offending institutions and poor at 3 out of 4 of them. And really they talked about that, essentially the failure of behaviour management that has meant that you've got these tensions where children are then kept apart, and then because they're kept apart and they've got very little to do, they start antagonising each other, and you end up in a cycle of violence that just recreates itself and escalates. I think the other point on the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child is that also sets out that we should be using custody only as a last resort and for the shortest amount of time possible, and that isn't really what we're seeing. And so part of the way of solving this is actually really implementing that and then reducing the numbers further and ensuring that once the children who really do need to be in custody are not subject to everything I've just described.
I just want to ask one more question, that is about the transition from youth custody to adult and the business of, I know that in order to ease the adult estate there was the movement to the 19th birthday from the 18th birthday, but I just wondered in practicality what impact does transitioning from youth to adult custody have on young offenders?
We've just done, we published last week a report on a piece of research we've done into the impact of that policy change from transitioning from 18 to 19. And really what that showed was that it's both vital to ensure the distinct character of the youth estate and maintain that for children, but also to prepare young people for transition. We need to make sure that there is a young adult first approach that really takes into account the needs of young adults. So just to sort of share with the committee, that policy change between March 22 and November 23 led to a 253% increase in the number of over 18s in the youth estate. So at a time when the youth custodial estate was already really, really struggling, suddenly there was a huge change, a great rise in the number of population and a change in who those people were and their needs. And so we saw both children and young adults subject to very little time out of cell, and children, the resources for children stretched thinner, and young adults not being able to get what they needed. So, for instance, the education provision isn't suitable for over 18-year-olds. And we talked to about 50 children and young adults as part of the research about the transition period and what works for them and what doesn't. And it's interesting because you get mixed views. So some young adults are really keen to move up. They want to go to the adult estate. They talk about getting away from the nonsense of the younger children. But there is a sense that they possibly don't have a full picture of what the adult estate is like. And transition can be hugely destabilising. So a lot of the services that are provided either fall away and aren't available once you move to the adult estate, or if they're still available, you've got a different provider providing them. So there's interruption. And of course, this is all in theory when that provision is available and people are able to access it. Other young people might not be ready to transition at all due to their levels of maturity. So we know neuroscience tells us that the brain matures until the mid to late 20s, and other vulnerabilities. And so often they find the prospect quite daunting. So we're really clear that actually a case-by-case approach to transition is really important. And that what we really need is a young adult approach that has aspects of the children's approach in it, but with other things that take into account that developing maturity and switch over into the adult estate to prepare people to move to that place.
Thank you very much. Moving on to Lindsay.
Yeah, if I can take you back to adults, please, and in particular, I'm interested in rehabilitative programmes in prisons. So starting with behaviour programmes or interventions, as I think they're also called. Could one of you please give a brief overview of offender behaviour programmes, what they are, how it's accessed, and what sort of content is delivered as part of those programmes, please?
I'll have a go. I'll just caveat that slightly, Lindsay. I've not been working in prisons for a while, so this is my best guess, I think, on offending behaviour programmes are generally run by the psychological team, the team of psychologists based in prisons, and there's several accredited programmes, and these are evidence-based and tested, allegedly, to reduce the risk of reoffending when someone engages in them. A person can come into prison, they have a sentence planning meeting which identifies which offending behaviour programmes they need to do depending on their offence and the reasons for their offending. Some are, well, a lot of them mainly look at thinking skills, look at the different types of cognitive deficits someone might have, and how the process of group work can help address that. And the theory is that if you go through this accredited behaviour programme, your risk will reduce because you've addressed some of the underlying issues behind why your offending took place, but mainly from a psychological perspective. So different prisons, especially the Cat C trainers, the Cat B trainers, which is where people spend a large proportion of their time. So if they've got longish sentences, they're supposed to be funded to run these accredited behaviour programmes. And a prisoner, technically cannot transition through their sentence or reduce their risk from going from a Cat B to a Cat C to an open unless they've addressed some of their offending behaviour requirements. Also, when they come up for parole, those are one of the key things that are looked at, whether they've completed the courses that have been identified for them.
Yeah, and I've got some comment, actually, if that's okay, on the kind of delivery and how that happens, particularly with the voluntary sector. So, as Pia said, the availability is critical to someone's progression in terms of their sentence. So I know the committee has interest around IPP sentenced prisoners, and that's one of the biggest issues, is about the prison that you are in or the prison you have access to won't allow you to do that progression, and overcrowding and understaffing makes that harder. In terms of the official interventions, as it were, they're often provided through either directly, as Pia says, through forensic teams or commissioned down under a thing called the National Framework for Interventions. Framework policy. Mm-hmm. I like a framework. And this was introduced, so in December 23, they introduced a new framework that kind of brought the previous models all into one place. But I think it's safe to say that it's caused quite a lot of confusion. So it's supposed to enable a prison to understand what it has available to it and what it needs, and how to understand that that's structured and replicable. And there seems to be a lot of confusion about what needs to be accredited. So unofficially, in a lot of prisons, you will have a lot of my members working, providing things that will help people with their rehabilitation. They will help people to desist, to address the factors that maybe help them contribute to them ending up in prison in the first place. But they are not ones that need to be accredited. And we've had this issue where people have been told, oh, you might need to stop delivering that because it's not accredited, and actually doesn't need to be. It's not formally part of that, but it has caused quite a lot of confusion because how information travels around the prison system, it travels individually around prisons rather than cascading to organisations. So you work in a prison, nobody knows that you're not a commissioned service or you're not contractually there as part of the, attitudes, thinking and behaviour framework service. So there's a lot of misinformation and confusion about it, and what you then end up with is you can end up with some really good practice, but it's completely inconsistent. And inconsistent is my watchword when I talk about provision in prisons, because you'll get the centrally commissioned stuff you have to have, and then you'll get that stuff that is part of what has been in that prison for years, but nobody understands that has been funded by a charitable trust or the National Lottery or the Lloyds Bank Foundation for 20 years, and nobody's thinking, how do you keep that going, that microbiome that you have in your prison of these people that have come in for years and provided support for families and and kept things ticking over, that all of a sudden if they can't work in that prison anymore because it's not facilitated. And the biggest issue for us in those kind of operations is the vetting of staff and volunteers, particularly if those volunteers have lived experience of this system.
Can I jump in? So you're describing a patchwork of services, accredited and non-accredited, above the radar, below the radar, and you seem to be describing a situation where an individual governor would not necessarily have a full grasp of exactly what's being delivered. Is that fair?
And even over the radar, as it were, some of it doesn't need to be accredited. So you've got the dynamic purchasing scheme for prison education, where those things don't all have to be accredited, but they'll have an evidence base and they'll have structure to them, but they're not accredited structured behavioural interventions. So you can kind of get that confusion. But yeah, I've gone to many prisons. It's my favourite thing to ask a governor. What have you got in your prison?
What would you do to make things more transparent, more visible, more regulated?
I don't know if regulated is what I do. In terms of looking at the consistency, I do think the national regime model is a very helpful tool in terms of there's a framework you need to get to, and then in our prison, what does that mean? What do we need? And the first thing I would do is find out who you have, what you have already. There's all sorts of brilliant things happen within prisons, but generally it's not planned, but you can coordinate it. So we, for example, have a member of staff working in HMP ISIS, which is a young adults prison, as Jess talked about, in London, and her job is to coordinate the voluntary sector, and that is to work with the prison to see what do we have and what do we need. And for example, there was a HMIP inspection that showed that there was real issues with the young men leaving prison with real financial illiteracy and massive issues with debt and benefit. So she was able to work with the prison, find out what they had, and then bring in from the local community organisations that could come in and do Money Matters programmes with the young men.
Just briefly add on to Pia's point about what is available. I think it's just worth highlighting that actually we hear a lot from people who have been released from prison that they did have within their sentence plan, the certain interventions that they were prescribed to take part in, but they couldn't because that wasn't available in the prison they were in. And they may have applied to transfer to another prison but weren't able to because of the levels of overcrowding. So I think it's just worth highlighting that those are they should be available to people, but there are in many places long waiting lists and just not enough provision.
What I'm hearing, and forgive me if I'm misunderstanding, is I've heard the word inconsistency, and I've heard here you were originally talking about thinking skills and looking at why people have acted in the way they have that has led them there. But then I'm also hearing that there's not always a programme available in a particular prison. So, for example, domestic violence is one that springs to mind, thinking skills specifically for that sort of area. Are you saying that it's a bit hit and miss as to, not necessarily with domestic violence specifically, but a bit hit and miss at different prisons, whether a programme that would actually be really beneficial to a particular prisoner is available in that prison, because it just depends on what's happening in that prison?
It's that, and it's complicated because the resources required to provide for supply to meet demand, that's the issue. So you have a finite number of psychologists based in particular types of prisons. There's a finite number of courses that can be delivered through the year, and the demand is far greater than their ability to meet that. So often you might have waiting lists for people. They're waiting to get to particular prisons, or when they get to the prisons, they're not being able to get to the course that they need to do. And there's two types of things. So one is your offending behaviour programs, and the other is your resettlement type programs. And both are crucially important around reducing reoffending or desistance. You need people to understand their risk and lower their risk, but there's risk and need. So some people have lower risks, so they commit lower level crimes, but their resettlement needs, which are around how they manage their debt, how they manage finance, how they manage their housing, how they hold down a job, how do they maintain family ties, those are equally important as a wraparound package that leads to better outcomes for them on release. And some prisons, in a sentence plan, the trump card is much more about offending behaviour programs than it is around resettlement programs. And I think that's a balance that needs to be addressed, because people are leaving. They may have done all the risk-assessed programs in the world, but if they don't have a home to go to, then all of that is wasted. And I think that's something that needs to be considered in prisons as well.
Sure. And I think that nicely moves on to purposeful activity as well, in terms of getting activity in place that's going to help with that in the future. But we talk about purposeful activity down here in Parliament a lot, but just for the record, would one of you just outline what purposeful activity actually means in practice?
I actually scribbled this one down in case you asked.
Yes.
So the definition for HMPPS talks about something that will address risk or needs related to reoffending or resettlement objectives, the enhancement of personal well-being, physical or mental health, and the enhancement of interpersonal, social and life skills. What we would say is, if you look at what's happening across prisons, almost nobody is in a prison that can fully meet their needs. And that is generally because they are overcrowded, but they're also overcrowded people that isn't how their needs will be met. So yeah, that's the technical definition.
So what does that look like in reality? And have you got any examples of really good purposeful activity that's being offered anywhere?
So the inspection reports, they did a kind of summary report of purposeful activity, and open prisons, some open prisons are showing good examples of purposeful activity. They drive regimes that have got release on temporary license. They've got the focus is on getting people out and about. Grendon Prison, which is a therapeutic community, always uses a good exemplar of purposeful activity. Some of the progression regime prisons like Warren Hill, Buckley Hall. I believe the committee visited Buckley Hall, and it's had some positive reports from the inspectorate. So there are the sort of lower category end of the spectrum are showing good purposeful activity, but generally the thematic showed that, with the exception of one prison that the inspectorate looked at, all had declining scores on purposeful activity.
And I think if I pick up, for example, education and work, only across HMPPS prisons, only around 50% of people are in education and work. That's a really low proportion. And even when they are in work, then actually that is often part-time. It's just a few hours a day, and really isn't preparation for release. You know, what we need to see is a real working day. And I guess what we've heard from everybody so far is just that pattern of inactivity and wasted opportunities across the estate. Yes, there are some better examples. Some prisons are doing better, but in many prisons, people are locked in cell far too long. They're not doing anything that's focused on rehabilitation. You know, it is most people who are in prison will be released at some point, so it's in everybody's interest that the whole of somebody's sentence and somebody's time in prison is focused on rehabilitation.
And there are massive issues in relation to diversity and lack of the right access. So I'm very happy to send to the committee one of our members. The Traveller Movement did a report funded by HMPPS, kind of on the back of the Lamy Review, into Gypsy Roma traveller people's access to purposeful activity. And as an example, these would be populations where formal education is not paramount, and yet, you know, physical labour will be. And yet in prison, if you don't have education, you don't have literacy and numeracy to a certain standard, you must take part in education, and it's not paid parity with paid work. So the things that you're going to need when you leave are not the things that you have to do in prison, and you know, this can be a massive issue.
Again, just a quick follow-up on that. So you said 50% of people are not in education or training when they're in prison. In a nutshell, why would you say that is? Is it staffing? What's the answer?
There's a number of reasons. One of them, I mean, staffing is certainly part of that. It's the opportunities available. There's not enough work available. There's not enough education available in prisons. Having said that, in some places there are spaces there that aren't being filled. There's issues certainly around the prison estate itself. So do they have the facilities there? But again, you know, you can read in inspection reports that actually there are classrooms that are empty. So it's often, you might find inappropriate curriculums that aren't targeted at the right people. You know, it's often the people that you'd want to be in education the most are often not getting it. The staffing issues, the security issues in prison, there's lots of factors in that. But actually, there still needs to be a priority on actually getting people into work and education.
Just for clarity, are the education programmes that you're describing that aren't fit for purpose, who is designing and delivering them?
I mean, the education is contracts and commissioned from HMPPS, and it's delivered by external providers. So some of those are voluntary sector or education providers who run education services outside prison as well, and they're delivering the education in prison. I mean, one of the challenges when we talk about staffing is certainly staffing with prison officers, but it's also staffing in lots of different roles within the prisons as well that just keep the kind of basic functioning of a prison going. There are challenges there, and certainly in education, I know one of the challenges is getting staff, getting teachers into those contracts. You know, to attract people into those roles, you need to be able to offer competitive packages.
And retaining those people. It's a big thing in the voluntary sector around getting people in the first place, getting the right people in, and then moving them physically around complexes and buildings that aren't designed for that. If they can't hold keys or they can't get key trained or your organisation feels it's not appropriate to hold keys and then deliver interventions with people in a way that makes them feel that you're a trusted person.
And also the cohort that education staff are having to deal with. The literacy levels of prisoners is woefully low. They've come from education experiences that are really, really poor. Trying to then get them to education where you're delivering a very similar curriculum like you might be doing when they were, you know, children is not appropriate. I think the creativity and the innovation in classrooms also needs to be stepped up.
We've got an amazing range within Clinks. We manage the National Criminal Justice Arts Alliance. We've got some phenomenal arts practice, creative practice that really helps people unlock learning. But again, it's a nice to have. And until the kind of need to have, if people aren't able to be unlocked for showers, then, you know, and then there's the public perception of why should people who have harmed us have access to creative things. And I think we just really encourage this thinking, to think about what is it that people will need so they never come back here again.
You've mentioned that open prisons tend to be the focus or tend to be where purposeful activity is really drilled down, and there's some good examples there. But if we look at kind of the other end of the spectrum and prisoners that are on IPP sentences that clearly will need to show that they've made progress. I think we saw when we went to Buckley Hall and also HMP Brixton that they had special units specifically dealing with or designed for IPP prisoners. And do you know how many other prisons have those sorts of units for IPP prisoners?
I think that Warren Hill was probably the first to have a progression regime, followed by Buckley Hall. But as far as I know, those are the only two prisons that have that. I think that a number of governors, I think Thorncross Prison is looking to try and have a similar regime. And I think that we would really encourage that to happen, not only in the open estate, but a version of that in the Cat C estate, because it's that transition from Cat C to open that's also a big barrier for people with IPP sentences.
Kind of moving it onto resettlement, then you have issues with people not being able to access things till certain points in their sentence based on their expected release date. So you've got these like groupings of people then that won't have access to anything. Because it's not their time yet, and then
they wait.
By the time that comes, it's pretty much rushed through. The experiences of organisations delivering resettlement services.
You mean not just IPP prisoners, it's others that will kind of get missed.
People doing determinate sentences, but maybe they're relatively long and the release date is quite a while in the future, so they're not prioritised for access to anything.
That's interesting. Okay. And so for IPP prisoners, would you say it's adequate at the moment for those or not? So it's not necessarily adequate for the people that are in other categories that have got a long time left, because the IPP prisoners are getting priority, if you like, but it's not adequate for them in any event. So
IPP prisoners really aren't getting priority. There's a few prisons where there are progression regimes and there are particular issues around, because the IPP sentence requires certain things to happen that aren't there. So it just really smacks of unfairness to us in our sector. Whereas you then have this additional issue for people serving long sentences, which is more and more prevalent and will be more and more prevalent unless, sentence inflation is really addressed in this Parliament. That you have that second group of people who can't access things because and that's more on their resettlement rather than their purposeful activities. So if you think about with IPP prisoners, it's often like going back to the interventions that are needed for sentence progression rather than pre-release.
Right, okay. That's really interesting, thank you. Can I just ask about, obviously we're talking in general terms about purposeful activity, and we've touched on IPP and category C and what have you, but what we've not touched on is how purposeful activity differs or doesn't differ, and whether it's adequate also for women and also for the youth estate, that the young people are probably two separate answers, I suppose, but if we could touch on women and on the youth in terms of what purposeful activity is looking like for them, and also whether it's being a success.
So there was a joint thematic inspection report published last year into work undertaken with women in prison and under probation supervision, and they've found that there is little evidence that progress is being made in addressing the reasons why women offend, and while evidence-based interventions designed to address women's needs are available, few women are given the opportunity to benefit from them. So that was published in May last year, so things will have moved on in some establishments, but I would say that the picture feels very real and very similar to what we're seeing now. There's definitely some examples of good practice across the prison estate. So Drinkwater recently had a really positive inspection report, and that showed some really good examples of purposeful activity. I'd say across the estate, the challenges remain in terms of what I was articulating earlier in terms of access. So there's definitely a challenge. You might be able to provide all the purposeful activity that you want to provide, but if women can't access it, that's a real challenge. And we're definitely seeing that across the estate. I would say that one of the challenges that we're seeing in terms of what's available to women, both focusing on their resettlement and rehabilitation, as well as what might be purposeful for them, is focusing on the gender-specific needs. So thinking about, you mentioned earlier, domestic violence and abuse, we know that around 60% of women in contact with the justice system have those experiences, and we know that it can be a driver of their offending, so they might be coerced into offending by a partner often. And we deliver some services to women across the estate for them to reflect on their experiences and to understand what support might be available to them, both in prison and in the community. But we see that provision is quite patchwork across the estate, and there isn't anything available consistently across all women's prisons for them to really reflect and understand what might be available to them and why that might have contributed to their offending, and that for us is a really significant gap. So I was reflecting on the answers from my colleagues earlier, and I think there's definitely a gap in terms of what's provided specifically for women, to look at what might draw them into the justice system, which is often quite different to men's experiences and make sure that they can access that provision that's really tailored to meet their needs. So I would say it's definitely a mixed picture across the estate, but domestic violence and abuse services definitely feel like a big gap for us.
Okay. Thank you. And for young people?
Yeah, so I also wrote down the definition of purposeful activity in the youth estate. The definition is slightly different, although I think it essentially amounts to the same thing, but it's structured activities that aim to develop skills, promote positive behaviour and prepare children for life after release, including education, vocational training, work programmes and other constructive activity. So, that could be art, youth work, various activities. And I think I've already mentioned that in October, HMI Prisons reported a real deterioration in the access to that, and they rated in 23-24 across all 4 youth offending institutions, they were rated not good enough, and 3 out of 4 of them were rated poor. And so even where the issues I talked about earlier around keeper parts are not stopping children from accessing those services, the organisations we work with, our members and the children they work with, talk about the breadth of that and the lack of breadth, in fact, and the lack of differentiation. So all children should have a plan about their needs, and there should be interventions in the prisons to support meeting those needs. But people tell us that breadth just isn't there. And if you sort of think about those kinds of activities, they very much are the activities that the voluntary sector is often in the best place to provide. But our members talk about real challenges in accessing the youth estate. I think there's challenges in accessing the estate, the secure estate as a whole, but the youth estate even more so. I think there's less commissioning opportunities. And then when they do have funding, as Anne was mentioning, from trusts and foundations, actually working out how to take that money and provide an offer and get it in and find the right person to contact to get into the youth estate to provide those services is really challenging. So part of that limits what is available. And I also wanted to, in connection with that, we did some research that we published early last year into what was needed for racially minoritised children who were transitioning to the adult estate. And that really talked about how important it was for organisations led by and for racially minoritised people to providing these kinds of services to them, how important that is to developing social capital and positive identities. But it's often those kinds of small grassroots specialist organisations that struggle the most to actually work in the secure estate and get in and provide those services. So we've got that mismatch in terms of need and what can be provided.
I'm just thinking exactly that there's people, organisations willing and ready to support our prisons, and then there's reports telling us that the prisons aren't providing it, and if only they could. And
we've had organisations have to hand back funding to charitable funders because they can't get in.
Right.
Essential services like it. So we could talk about this a lot, and very happy to over the lifetime of this Parliament and the work that you do, because I think it's really important to see there's not just a statutory offer. In justice, it's massively important that we support and we see the role and value of voluntary organisations, particularly those organisations from people's communities, of people's communities, by and for, that can walk alongside them. So we talk a lot about that kind of phrase and how this person has ended up in prison. They're here now, but they want to come back to a community where, they have to be able to contribute and live and heal and recover and whatever it is, and not harm again or cause harm. And a lot of those things cannot be provided as adequately by the system, which is essentially there to punish. Yes, it's there to punish and rehabilitate, but under pressure, all it can do is the punitive element. So there is a role, and there's a huge amount of money comes in. Half of our sector are not funded in any way by the statutory sector. So there's this richness of, Quaker trusts and all of these foundations with a great history in the country about working in rehabilitation. And yet we have these very practical issues. And I think the intention is there, certainly with HMPPS, to get that to work. Some of the issues are actually central government contracting problems. And the fact that we're obsessed with contracting anyway, and we don't really like grants. That's a whole different inquiry.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think we were planning to move on to contracted services. I don't know whether Pam's got an interest in this.
It's a particular obsession of mine around the mixed economy of justice and its failings. It seems to be absolutely delivering it at some level, but absolutely failing in others. And what's your experience of delivering contracted services, if you are contracted, or of commissioning them if you commission them?
And I do an overview, and then some of the delivery organisations can come in. So that is our bread and butter at Clinks. We're really, really interested in making sure that there is a really vibrant, like you say, a mixed economy of organisations that are able to get in to deliver. The majority are registered charities, which means they have identified beneficiaries and a public benefit that they can provide and need to provide. So, for example, Mr. Chairman, you talked about the Upper Room. They're a member of Clinks. Organisations like that, that's who they need to reach in order to meet their charitable purpose. So you need a system that enables that and allows for that to happen. So the way things work at the moment, and it is central government rules, but also then put into a delivery model that isn't about commissioning. The people who commission in prisons are prison staff, heads of reduced and reoffending, heads of learning and skills, and they're given often quite unwieldy models to use, usually called things like dynamic, which is very ironic. But they'll have commissioning frameworks, they'll have contract rules, and I think we talk a lot, don't we, about the relationships are often very good, and you'll have somebody, just the commissioner, and someone that's desperate to do the service, and they'll work so hard together, but the rules are in their way. So we have contracts that are not priced sufficiently well. So we have massive amounts of compensation, and we can't get full cost recovery. So people are adding, supplementing and subsidising. And I haven't got an issue with supplementation where your organisation goes in, it has a family's contract, and you also have a play worker that's been funded by True Colours Trust. That's great. But if you're actually having to use that money to prop up the contract because the contract is insufficient, then that is a problem. And we have a massive overuse of that. Can't get full cost recovery. We have a lack of flexibility on contracts. So I spoke to a provider last week who has a number of contracts that are on kind of prison-based lots. And if there's an underspend in one but an overspend in the other, then tough. And you can't move that about. So that means you won't really get a scale where some organisations might be able to provide scale. And we've got real concerns. We don't know what the budgets are in this year. That's nearly finished for the dynamic purchasing system, which is where a lot of small organisations will get money working in prisons. And we don't yet know what the settlements are for next year, and the commissioning intentions aren't very clear. And then prisons don't necessarily know what they need to pay for. And what they don't need to pay for out of central budgets. So there are quite a lot of issues just about how it all happens. And as a result, we have big national prison contracts where nothing is happening and there are empty classrooms, and my members are being asked to provide something for the men and women in those prisons, and yet there is no money to pay.
I'd like to say thank you for that, but I'm not sure I mean it. But yes, thank you for that.
Thank very much. We've got 3 more groups of questions to go through. I'm going to take a very short break, just for 5 minutes. So if we adjourn the committee now, and we'll resume at 15:56. Thank you. Order. We'll reconvene this afternoon's Justice Select Committee. We were taking evidence from witnesses in relation to our rehabilitation and resettlement inquiry, and the next set of questions will come from Orinda Joss.
Yeah, can I ask you a few questions on the release on temporary licence, ROTL for short, if I can call it that. First of all, how is it used to promote rehabilitation? And the other question I had in mind was that we, sadly, because of court backlogs, we can have remand prisoners who are on remand for a long time. Mm-hmm. Is ROTL available to them as well?
I want to go first? Yes, stop. ROTL is it's a really effective tool that prisons have to be able to get people out into the community. There's different types of release on temporary licence. So the one we most commonly talk about is for work purposes, and that's part of resettlement, day release. That's the majority of where the ROTL takes place, but there are other purposes for it as well, which might be other resettlement needs. So it might be getting people ready before they're released. There might be childcare ROTL. There's also special purpose ROTL if somebody needs to go to a family funeral, etc., and those kind of instances. All ROTL is risk assessed. There's no automatic right to ROTL, but it is absolutely a really important piece of the jigsaw to get people into a habit of work, get them out of the prison, get them in a workplace, learning skills or re-skilling after time in prison, both the kind of hard and soft skills that you get in a workplace. It also helps people to earn money, to start saving for release. They also contribute into the Victims Fund. There are a lot of very positive outcomes from ROTL. What I would say is that although we have seen some increases in the numbers recently, it's still not back to pre-pandemic levels, and in fact, even that wasn't high enough, would be our view. We need to really look at how we increase the use of ROTL because it is an effective tool. Now, we have done quite a lot of work around this, and last year we spoke to a number of employers about this, and they were employers who were really committed to this agenda. They already run ROTL schemes, but they were saying how difficult it is, how really difficult to get people out on ROTL. And that actually, they might try and put something in place. It can take 6 months until that actually then happens. For people who are committed to the agenda, that's fine. They'll keep going. They'll keep pushing that. But actually, we're going to need lots of other employers involved in this if we want to get the rates of employment up for people on release. So it's a really good thing. We need much more of it. I would say simpler processes that support employers would help that. Obviously, the kind of issues around overcrowding and security concerns in prisons have an impact as well. So people might be ready to be on ROTL. They might be due to go out. If something happens on the wing, if it gets closed down, that means that person's not going out on ROTL that day. That has a huge impact.
The ROTL wings that maybe we would have seen before, whereas in a prison where there's a group of people going out every day because of staffing issues and security, there wouldn't be the staffing to have that, and therefore it doesn't happen. Yep. I think pre-pandemic, we were getting somewhere with some policy and framework changes, but then post-pandemic it hasn't recovered, and I think the figures are still a bit skewed with early release and the different schemes last year, that people that would have been ROTL eligible maybe weren't getting it at that time.
And just on your specific question about remand prisoners aren't eligible for ROTL, is my understanding. No. So there's much more that we could do, I would say. I think my understanding is that at the minute there's no men's prison within the M25 that's using ROTL. And so there's real challenges about how we increase that, but we should be focused on increasing it.
No, I just
Just so I can.
How it works in the youth estate, because there's some slight differences in that there's currently some work being done on a new policy framework for ROTL in the youth estate, because up until now the adult policy has just applied to the children's estate, and this is an example of what happens quite often where, because the youth estate is under HMPPS policy is made for the adult world and it just gets applied to children without thinking about children first and foremost. So we really have welcomed the look at the policy again, but we do think that it could actually go further than the draft that we've currently seen. So one of the things, for instance, that is being changed is the amount of time a child has to wait before they become eligible for ROTL, which obviously makes sense that it would be less time than maybe in the adult estate, but actually we think it should be immediately from the moment the child is in custody, because the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child specifies that we should only be sending children to custody for the shortest time possible, actually therefore making ROTL available very early on, particularly in a context where there's no open estate, there's no open prisons in the youth estate. If you're not in a secure children's home, you don't have access to those kinds of things like trips out shopping or that kind of step down that prepares you for release. So ROTL is the really, really important tool, and if you're only convicted to custody for, say, 2 months, the earlier that can start, the better. So we're really welcoming that new policy, but we would like to see it go somewhat further.
Yeah, I mean, it is a success story, isn't it? Because the research shows that it does reduce offending and also the number of offences that are committed. But we've had some limitations placed on ROTL, haven't we?
Yeah, and we're really only seeing ROTL for work where we're really seeing it at all now. So I was the deputy chair of Lord Farmer's review into family ties in the Mail estate, with Nicola actually at the time. And one of the things that we found was, ROTL for family leave, people preparing to return to the family home by having weekends at home and getting into those roles that they come out of in prison. ROTL has absolutely, it's got a massive role to play in resettlement preparation, but also in keeping family relationships going. And it also has a relationship in terms of the economy within the voluntary sector. I, for many years, had staff on ROTL working in Clinks when we had an office. And it was really effective, and it was a great way to work with colleagues and help the staff in Clinks that didn't have lived experience know what it was like, and just the red tape, and to understand every time what was going on.
You said you would like to have it expanded, so why the limitations? Why do you think?
I think a lot of the limitations are not necessarily the policy itself, but the conditions. It's almost like there's so much to do in prisons that you can't get to ROTL. ROTL is almost impossible to achieve in an when open prisons are overcrowded, you're in trouble.
Yeah, I mean, I think ROTL it has had bad press, unjustifiably. The fact is that, we've got a statistic, 99.8% of people who go on ROTL come back successfully. However, the small percentage of people that have gone on to offend further, it gets disproportionate amount of publicity, and then that causes a whole sort of withdrawing of the privilege of it. As you said, that ROTL, of course, does reduce reoffending, but the way that ROTL works in open prisons, and I used to govern an open prison, it's very tightly risk assessed. So you start off with an accompanied ROTL. So a prison officer will go with you. They will make sure that you understand what you're required to do. And it's a stepped process. So by the time you're accessing either your family leave or your education leave or your work leave, you're ready for it and you're prepared for it. So I think that it has had bad press, but actually the evidence shows that in almost all cases, ROTL is successfully applied in open prisons. The other issue is getting employers to be interested in taking on people who are in prison.
And how does it compare with other mechanisms for rehabilitation? So how does ROTL compare with something else that you might be doing to help rehabilitation?
For people who've got long sentences, that's probably one of the best ways of getting them integrated back into the community. If they've spent a long time in prison and are undoubtedly institutionalised due to that, ROTL offers a real opportunity to gradually and at pace, get them back on track.
It's quite dated now, but there was a combined HMI probation rehabilitative activity thematic. It's quite old, but it did talk about ROTL specifically in terms of also that imagining and trying something out, that imagining things different and putting into place those things. And because it's so difficult to get things happening in prison, people ROTL for education, they ROTL for training, and it's part of their rehabilitative journey and then part of their preparation for resettlement.
I move on to remand prisoners. So I mean, there are lots of issues of concern, aren't there, with remand prisoners, because a lot of them find themselves, they're more likely to harm themselves. and they're more likely to have maintain contact with family and so forth. So the national regime model that we have been talking about does require that reception prisons should have a system, should have a regime offer that they provide to the remand prisoners. So how does the regime that you have for remand prisoners differ from the regime that you might have for other prisoners?
So the remand prisoners actually do fall through the net, actually, because they are not obliged, governors are not obliged to provide a regime for remand prisoners. So they don't have to access purposeful activity, they don't have to access education or workshops or work whilst they're in prison. The very slight benefit that they might get is that they have more visits. But in reality, ironically, people on remand are now spending the most amount of time in prisons. They're the longest standing prisoners because cases are taking longer and longer to come to court. And often people who are on remand will get to court and then they're either time served or they're found not guilty. And in the meantime, they've done very little preparation because the priority is for sentenced prisoners. Often remand prisoners get trusted jobs if they're lucky, so jobs that require a more stable population in the prison, so kitchen workers or cleaners, but very little is being done because very little is mandated in terms of their resettlement needs whilst they're in custody.
And
they often get very little.
The issue we talked about earlier with a release date, kind of setting access to what you might get when, because you haven't got a release date, because you haven't yet got a sentence, then and massive issues, just the sheer numbers. It's not designed for the numbers that we have.
Yeah, and probation are not obliged to work with them on release either. So they might spend a long time, they've lost their homes, their strained relationships with their family members, lost their jobs, etc. And whereas sentenced prisoners would have some obligation to have support around those resettlement needs, remand prisoners, no one has the duty to do that. So they have a double whammy.
So they might serve all of their sentence whilst being in remand, but still not have engaged in any purposeful activity.
Or have any support on release.
Right, so they lose out. Do they gain anything in terms of having more contact with family members and like you mentioned, more other activities that they perhaps could do? So do they do anything?
The only additional thing is additional social visits, so visits with your family once a week. In practice generally, but it also depends on whether the provision is there and anything else, and that somebody has been identified by the family service within the prison as a remand prisoner.
So, I think the remand population is now about 20% of the whole population, so it's a huge number of people, and most of them will be in the kind of Cat B local prisons, which are where the biggest challenges of the regime are at the minute, where really poor provision and, the churn makes them really unstable prisons, so it's a real challenge. They do, in theory, as been said, get some additional kind of rights within that, but even like recent prison inspection reports, so I think Wandsworth and Lewis were fairly recent reports, highlighted that the remand population there weren't having their needs met. And as you say, there's higher rates of self-inflicted deaths amongst the remand population. There's such a huge level of instability. Just specifically to the resettlement point, there is now, so we deliver accommodation advice and support for people coming out of prison. That has recently been increased to include the remand population, so there is some support available in terms of accommodation. But as Anne said, you don't necessarily know when somebody's going to be released, so you can't do what you would have done with a sentenced population of saying your release date is X, we can put in place 12 weeks of support in advance and get all of these things ready and get all these applications in. Of course, that's not possible. But in principle, I think the big challenge is there are too many people being remanded to custody. So actually what we need to be looking at is how we reduce the numbers of people who are being remanded to custody and how we look at what the alternatives are in the community.
Can I just pick up on that? Sorry, Nicola. Just from a children's point of view, So from the children's point of view, children on remand should have a remand worker, and they are meant to engage with them to do some remand planning and review and encourage them to engage in that purposeful activity. But in reality, given everything else I have already said about the way the regime is working, their experience of custody is very similar to convicted children. And just to pick up on the stats, so in the children's estate, 43% of children in custody are on remand, and the 62% of children who are remanded into custody go on to not receive a custodial sentence. And there's about a 50-50 split within that number of those that are acquitted and those that receive a community sentence. And I think it's also really important to highlight that there's significant racial disparity in the numbers who are remanded into custody. So if you're black or racially minoritised, you're far more likely to be remanded into custody. So there is a real urgent need to make sure that custody is really used as the last resort. We lobbied for some changes to the Police Crime and Sentencing and Courts Bill, and we're really pleased that some of our recommendations were included in the final act that would address this. But I guess we're keen to see what the impact of those has been, and it's a bit unclear whether that's had the intended impact or whether some of the issues in the community about the lack of accommodation in the community is actually trumping the legislative changes. So we'd be really keen for MOJ to carry out an assessment of the impact of that, so that we can really understand what's driving those judicial decisions, and including what's driving judicial decisions around the racial disparity as well.
Just a quick question on this before I move on to my final question. So, because remand prisoners are not subject to any formal regime, they could end up being in a worse position as regards resettlement, can't they?
Yeah. Can I give the picture of women and what we're seeing with women? Because we work with unsentenced women who are on remand in some of the prisons in Surrey. And absolutely, some women talk to us the challenges that you feel like you're stuck in limbo, you can't access what you need to access. There were women that we've worked with who were mentally well when they went in on remand, were found not guilty, and then have PTSD when they're in the community just because it was such a traumatic experience. I've got a quote from a woman we're working with, and she said, as a remand prisoner, you can't apply for jobs in the prison because you can't be certain you will return after court. So it's a really challenging environment that women are in if they're remanded to custody. The numbers are at a 50-year high, and 3/4 of women who are remanded will either be found time served, not guilty, or receive a community penalty. So the use is incredibly disproportionate, especially if you take into account the impact that it has on women's mental health. We talked about the high levels of self-harm for women who are remanded into custody. And absolutely would agree with what Jess was highlighting about the racial disproportionality. We see racially minoritised and migrant women disproportionately represented at all parts of the justice system, but including on remand. We've pulled together a briefing that focuses on that issue. That we had a specific session with our APPG focusing on that. I'm very happy to share that briefing with the committee if that's of use. And I agree that we need to look at reducing the number of women on remand as a matter of urgency, and we were disappointed that the remand wasn't taken into account as part of the sentencing review, and that was omitted from that piece of work. So we hope that the Ministry of Justice really takes a focus on remand, because not only is it incredibly high and having a detrimental impact on women, but it's also having a real impact on the rest of the sentence population. So some women's prisons, there's one women's prison, for example, 68% of that prison are women on remand, and we're seeing that the prison is needing to almost kind of ring fence those spaces, so women are being shipped out of that prison quite quickly if they're sentenced, which is making it challenging for them to settle, but also they are then sent even further away from their homes, which we know is already a problem in the women's custodial estate because it's so geographically dispersed. So the remand population is having a big impact on the settled sort of sentence population, as well as having its kind of own unique challenges.
Just before you move on, Miranda, could I just bring the thread? Sure.
Thank you. You've spoken about the need to reduce the number of people on remand. Now, I believe the test that magistrates would use is that remand should only be used for those who pose a serious risk to the public or absconding. So the question I ask you is, are you saying the test is wrong and should be changed in some way? Or are you saying that the test is correct, but the magistrates are remanding too many people?
Good question. I was going to say that it can be really challenging to understand why those decisions are being made. So there isn't nationally available data for us to see why people are being remanded into prison, which makes it really challenging to understand the picture. So if you don't obviously know the problem, then you can't look to address it. We know sometimes women can be remanded for their own protection. There is no definition of what that means, so that's really difficult to understand how that decision is being made. And there was some research, I think, a year ago by Justice that looked at magistrates' decision-making. I'm very happy to share that report with the committee because I think it found that some of the decisions weren't based on updated frameworks, and where things had been changed, magistrates didn't necessarily have that information to hand. So, but I suppose the challenge for us is really understanding why those decisions are being made, and there isn't a lot of clarity about why that's happening. But I would refer you back to my previous statistic that most women are either found not guilty, receive a community penalty or time served, and we know that most women in prison, about 75% of them, are sentenced because they've committed a non-violent offence, so they are not a danger to society if you kind of use it in that way. So
the tests are also really quite subjective. So you've got these two things, risk and absconding, and you've got a magistrate who hasn't necessarily had quite a lot of training and doesn't know what else there is and how to balance that risk. Then it becomes quite a high stakes test. And what we found, what the Justice study found last year, was that people are overly cautious.
I think also with women, the issue that Nicola raised about being remanded as a place of safety, I think that's disproportionately the case with women, because women do present with multiple complex needs, and I think that there's a view that prison is the safest place for them. And I imagine that if you looked at the number of women that are on remand in women's prisons currently, they will be the ones that people don't know what to do. And I think that that's something that needs to be addressed by practical solutions as alternatives. So the CAS 2 provision, which is looking at kind of bail options, should be something that the MOJ, I think that they're looking at increasing access to that, and I think that's something that needs to be considered.
And just to add from the children's perspective, like that's exactly why we need that analysis of the changes that were included in the Police Crime Sentencing and Courts Bill, to see actually whether the changes that magistrates taking them into account, has that had an impact, and what's happening, and then there might be lessons for other parts of the estate as well.
Do you want to come in on this?
Yeah, so the idea that women are being remanded into custody to prevent risk to those women is, superficially at least, a surprising one. Can you give me some examples of situations in which that would be happening, and also how much that must be costing?
I think it's probably best if I come back with more concrete examples, just to make sure that I'm being accurate, but yeah, I can send that over.
So you've already acknowledged that only a minority of women who are on remand will end up receiving a custodial sentence, and there's a prison strategy white paper published back in 2021 that confirmed that. And also, because of that statistic, there was an ambition to release more women on bail. Has that happened, and has it had any impact on policy and on practice, on the way that women prisoners are actually dealt with?
Doesn't appear to have. Would you agree?
I agree. Yeah.
I think that the ambition is there, but it's not. Doesn't feel like it's followed through in practice, because the numbers of women in remand in the women's estate is increasing.
They're not getting bail in the way that was perceived.
I think there needs to be resourcing for those services, adequate resourcing, so that there's confidence built amongst the judiciary that those alternative options can be used meaningfully. Some concerns are probably legitimate as well. Women, especially a woman who may have been the victim of domestic violence, and that's a factor. So if you are worried about putting this woman back into the home where she's facing abuse, people often feel that they don't have viable solutions as alternatives, but that's why it's so important. But sending them to prison is not a viable option. In fact, it is more traumatizing and more destabilizing. The solutions need to be in terms of what those alternatives are in the community.
Thank you for that. Thanks.
Thank you very much. Mike, did you want to come in there?
Yeah, you've actually answered some of my questions along the way, but there is quite a broad question that to give you an opportunity, really, in case bits have been missed, around what you would do to redesign the prison regime if there were no limitations. So anything you'd like to get out, now's a pretty good opportunity to do that.
I'd love to, thank you. So we did a piece of work. It's only 4 points. We did a big piece of work with our membership. The Clinks thinks about, what would we do if we were able to. So significantly reduce the population of people in prison. Looking at some of those populations I've mentioned already, increase alternatives by diverting resources to proven community alternatives and not extra prison places. And specifically, one of the things that I think would be very helpful in these instances is the use of deferred sentences to allow intervention. So you don't remand somebody, you defer a sentence, you allow that person to get support and help that they will not be able to access in prison. Thank you.
Anyone else want to?
Actually, to be honest, I'll just make a very quick point about it, Jess, is that there isn't anything wrong with the ambition. So even the new regime design, nothing wrong with it. It's the enactment of it that's causing the problem. We've had previous iterations of this, and we get attracted to a new shiny policy, and all the energy goes in trying to implement the shiny policy. But the reality is unless you reduce capacity in prisons, unless you train staff properly to deliver the ambition, unless you make prisons safer and more ordered, none of that actually matters. So I think that if you're asking me if I had a blank piece of paper, I might even go back to a previous iteration of what a regime model needs to look like, but really focus on delivery and how it's done. And the only way to do that is to make prisons less crowded.
This is a problem we see across many issues, of course. Anyone else want to come in on that?
Yeah, from the sort of children's perspective, I mean, first and foremost, ensure that the UNCRC principles of custody being used as a last resort and the shortest period of time possible really are implemented. And we did some work some years ago around the legislative framework and how it could be amended to really make sure that that actually happens, and we'd be happy to share that. It might need some updating, but we could share that. And I suppose so that as part of that, then when children are, where it is needed that children are in custody, to move away from institutions that look like as close to adult prisons as some of the institutions we have do. And that includes things like not using children's prisons as overflow for adult prisons, which is what we saw with the change in the age, and really ensuring that the distinct character of the children's estate is properly protected and maintained. I'd also say things like the government is currently still considering whether they're going to introduce the use of pava incapacitance spray into the children's estate, which is something that we think is wholly inappropriate. And the evidence base is essentially very, very clear that what children need are small units close to their homes with staff who are trained in a way that allows them to be welfare-based and children's rights respecting. So not really prison officers, but actually staff with a much broader range of skills. And the closest model we have to that is secure children's homes. So really our view is that we need to close YOIs and STCs and focus on the secure children's homes that we know are the closest to that evidence model.
Thank you. Anything on women specific at all, Nicola?
Yeah, I would support what Anne articulated in terms of looking to radically reduce the prison population. And we're really pleased to see that the Women's Justice Board has now been set up and the government have committed to reducing the women's prison population with the ultimate aim of looking to close some women's prisons. And the focus really needs to be on prevention and diversion and community support. And we know a lot of that community support exists. We deliver some of it, our kind of sister organisations deliver women-centred support in communities to address the needs that might bring women into contact with the justice system in the first place. So I think once we've focused on really ensuring that women get the support that they need and can be kept in their communities, which I see as a longer-term vision and will require some transition and investment. I completely recognise that. But then we will have, I would imagine, a small population of women that would be in a secure establishment, and then it gives you the opportunity to think about what that establishment needs to look like. I would say there's definitely, if you think about the desistance process, it's all about your kind of autonomy, your ability to make decisions for yourself, your links with your family, accessing your basic level of need. I'd say any establishment that would keep a woman in a secure environment would need to make sure that she could absolutely have the basics, but access to medical care, ability. We saw before the pandemic, often women were able to have freedom of movement within the prisons. That has been significantly reduced, but that can really help you just in terms of feeling like a human being and able to access what you need. So I say we need to stop situations where women can become institutionalised because their decision making is essentially taken from them. And if there were a secure establishment, that we would need to make sure that that was moved back on, for want of a better phrase.
Thank you. My next question was actually about desistance, so it's perfect timing. Could someone just explain the principles of that, please, just so we can fully understand it?
Yeah, shall I start?
You've touched on it there already.
Yeah, when I used to work for Clinks, and I wrote a briefing paper about desistance, so let's see how much I remember of that. So desistance is a process that, and it's not a linear process, and it's a process through which somebody can go through if they've offended, and the process through which they might not offend. And it focuses on what might draw you into contact with the system in the first place, and some of those things you might need to have in place to support you when you're maybe in the community if you're in prison. So strong family ties are really important, being able to access accommodation, employment is really important as well. I mean, it might sound silly, but access to money and benefits often. So it's the kind of basic things you need in place to then support you on your journey if you've been in contact with the justice system to prevent you from offending in the future.
And what do you think, quite broadly, could be done better to ensure that that does happen?
Can I quickly jump in and add, because it's slightly different for children. So the majority of children who come into contact with the criminal justice system will naturally grow out of that behaviour. And it's widely recognised that there's a sort of age crime curve, and that actually contact with the justice system is in itself criminogenic and draws children in and escalates their behaviour. So the most important thing for children is diverting them away from the formal justice system as early as possible. And so, you know, the work that the Youth Justice Board and Youth Justice Services around being child first has really taken on those principles, and the child first approach tries to integrate that into the way children are worked with in the community at least.
Thank you.
Just add, I mean, I guess some of the really important principles here are around taking an approach that's based on someone's strengths and also very personalised to their individual needs. And, you know, there's a really important things around celebrating success and, you know, recognising that and engendering hope. And I think that's really difficult in the prison system at the minute. I think that isn't built into the way that prisons work. I think there is much more we can do to try and embed those principles. We certainly hear from people that they feel that certainly progress isn't celebrated in the way that something that's gone wrong is picked up on. So, you know, when we talk about it being a process, that's also recognising that it's not just in one direction. Sometimes things go wrong, sometimes there's a step back, but actually it's a journey. And so actually the kind of punishment side of, you know, when something hasn't quite gone as well where they wanted it to is harsher than the recognition of success and progress.
And criminal records themselves and the criminal record system in this country is not in any way desistance informed, you know, because you never get to move away. You know, even if your conviction is spent and there are different conditions on you or less conditions on you. So I think, like, I am a big fan of desistance, and, you know, the academics really know their stuff. And I think desistance has a place within a well-working system where you're not criminalising people's social needs, and also where you can look at then how do you support those people who have, where it is a criminogenic need and they are in the system with an issue, that this is a good theoretical framework. So things like being able to have celebrations and being able to mark what's good and not just what's bad. But I think as long as well as we don't allow people the right to be forgotten, like when you look at things like vetting, we'll have organisations that will have people who have been down that road and they want to come and work with people, and because they have those convictions, even though what they are doing is so desistance informed and they are exactly what people inside need, they will not be able to enter those establishments because they were previously there before.
I think just a small point to add to that. There's a very good paper written by Fergus O'Neill, which I can pass on to the committee. It's called 4 Forms of Rehabilitation. And one of the key things in that is that no matter how much work you may have done, either through interventions you've received in prisons, etc., the fundamental point is the othering of individuals and the role that othering plays in you not being able to see yourself as integrated part of the society you come back to. And I think that the system needs to also look at the structure around prisons and what we're doing, as Anne said, to support people who come out of prisons as well. So it becomes a very crucial factor, and unless we get those mechanisms right, we're not actually serving the desistance theory well.
That's really interesting. I mean, obviously we've seen some great examples, like in Brixton, for example, where they go into the restaurant to serve, and that's really encouraging. And yes, that sort of positive reinforcement almost, isn't it? And then a whole other debate around vetting and barring, I think. So, thank you.
Thanks very much, Mike. It is, Pam, I'm just pointing out that we're going a little bit over time. Is that okay with the witnesses if we conclude our questioning? Thank you, Pam.
Thank you. I'm going to take us to the community now, and community commissioned rehabilitation services, CRS. Could you give us a quick overview of how well that's working and throw in how you'd change it for the better, since we're short of time?
So, Helen's asked me to do a very quick overview. So, originally, commissioned rehabilitative services were commissioned through pathways. So a number of pathways, basically the areas of need that people have: finance, benefit and debt, housing, women-specific, which was really positive. We weren't successful in getting specific pathway for racially minoritised people, which means you then have a particular set of difficulties around getting culturally specific and culturally appropriate rehabilitative services for people. They were commissioned through this dynamic framework, and Richard Oldfield did a review for the then Prisons Minister, Lucy Fraser, a few years ago. So we did a big focus of it in Clinks around kind of getting ready, those day one services and how ready things were. Generally, the issue is with the contracting and how it works. So the pricing and a lot of the bureaucracy I talked about earlier on. But one of the big things for me with CRS and with any of this is that we have gone from model to model, mainly starting with the transforming rehabilitation reforms, where what we now have is a commissioned set of services rather than a dynamic partnership between one set of providers or one sector that has an offer to the people that need it when they're coming into the community, either serving community sentence or serving a licensed portion on release. And one of the big things we've lost that our sector is particularly good at is the through the gate dynamic. That idea that somebody, like, as it's a big part of desistance, we talked about, mentoring, befriending, someone to take you from one state to the other and help you to do that commission. So overall, some major challenges with it, but I would say that the department does listen. The contract management we hear from members, pretty good. People really trying to make it work, but overall some remaining challenges.
So we deliver at Nacro a number of those CRS services as they're referred to. So accommodation advice, which I mentioned earlier, personal wellbeing services. So how it happens in practice is that probation officer will do an assessment of an individual's needs and will say, right, this person might need help with accommodation, they might be at risk of homelessness, they need some support with wellbeing, and therefore refer them to the provider in that area who's delivering that service. There are real challenges with the model that was brought in, and it came in with a reunification of probation. The idea that is that the probation officer kind of holds it all centrally, and then they do all those referrals out, which in theory is a good idea, I would say, but in practice it hasn't worked very well. And I think part of that is because it's very siloed. And so what happens is we might have somebody referred to us for an accommodation support need. They might be referred to another number of other services. We don't know that, so we can't join up our support package at all. And then there's a lot of kind of to and fro communication with the probation officer. And at a time when we know that probation are under extremely high capacity challenges, I think there are things that we can do to kind of ease that and make that work better. But also just from an individual perspective, you know, having lots of different people and services to deal with when we could be providing much more joined up support feels quite frustrating. And as Anne said, you know, that they do listen, the team are listening, and I think in terms of the next round of those services, we are hopeful that that model will be different, but there certainly are challenges. Sorry, go on.
Okay, just thinking about how to improve on the current model.
Yeah.
Is data sharing between agencies one of the things that could be improved? For example, would you like to give us some other suggestions as well?
I think data sharing is a really good example to raise. It's a real challenge for us. So previously, we had access to the probation services case management system, and we were able to get all the relevant information that we needed on that individual to give them the support they need. That's no longer the case, and now we will take a referral from probation. They will send us information. Quite often, that might not be all the information we may need. We don't necessarily have kind of license conditions, information about risk, and we're going, you know, quite often going back and trying to get that information, which is both time-consuming, can delay the support that we want to have in place. So we need to find much better ways of information sharing. And the same point that I made earlier about there's so many different agencies. If we all were able to access that, we would put together. I mean, that's what the voluntary sector does. We work in an integrated way around somebody's needs. So we think there's definitely better information sharing. We would say also, I think there's a role that the voluntary sector providers in the space can play. So we could take on more of that assessment of need. It's absolutely what we already do, and integrate those partners, because that's already kind of what we're doing, but we want to do it in a much more integrated, holistic way, and I think that would also ease capacity constraints on probation.
We made a number of recommendations to the probation reset programme, and we would, in the sentencing review, where we've recommended that those things become permanent, because what really happens with probation, it all comes down to an individual probation officer's ability to manage a very big and very dynamic caseload and all these other people. So things like the use of rehabilitative activity requirement days, unpaid work, the period of time that someone's under supervision. And what we do see is often that supervision and support are seen as having the same timescale, and actually some people won't need to be supervised, but they will need support, and that is different. So one of the things we're quite pleased that we don't have anymore is post-sentence automatic post-sentence supervision, and we're hoping that that will become a permanent change, because more people were basically brought into the net.
Okay. Is it fair to say, just in the interest of time, that you know what drives desistance? Esteem, relationships, housing, work, support. You know who can deliver it, but currently the mechanism isn't there to get those services to the people who need them when they need them. Is that fair?
And the funding isn't there, and even the way the mechanism works, it doesn't encourage bigger organisations to be able to work with smaller organisations. It doesn't enable smaller organisations to offer what they do. Because it's mainly using contracting. Anyway, so yeah, I think just
tempted to ask: has the marketisation of end-to-end offender management been a success? Would you say?
I don't know if it's really happened either. It's because it was brought to a different market. Because we had the TR reforms And then we had this, and this has gone primarily to the voluntary sector, but the whole thing hasn't, because there is all that work that is not understood, that is funded by charitable trusts and foundations, that underpins most of the services that are there.
Okay, thank you. I'll leave it there, Andy. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Sarah.
Oh, jeez, I don't have access to my questions. Sorry.
Yeah, I think if it's all right with you, we'll leave the last two. But I think if you want to deal with licence recall.
Yeah, I specifically actually wanted to ask though about licence recall conditions that have been explicitly discriminatory practices. Where there's been concerns particularly about victims of domestic abuse, for instance, being on tags and then being recalled because they haven't returned to their scheduled address. Can you talk about that problem for us, please?
Yeah, absolutely. Yes, sorry, I just wanted to find my case study. So, yeah, we do have some examples of where women have been, resettled to addresses that really aren't safe for them. So I've got an example here of a woman who, through one of the projects, we were working with a woman who was in an abusive relationship. She was released from prison on tag that required her to remain in the home where she was at risk. During that time, her abusive partner kidnapped her. She went missing for several days. This incident made her breach her tag conditions, and then she was then recalled because of this. When she became eligible for release, she was told that she wouldn't be granted that because of her own concerns over her own safety. And we do see instances where the women that we're working with might have been resettled to an address that isn't safe for them, and if things aren't put in place appropriately and they leave that address, then we have seen them being recalled. And I would say that's a really, good example. I don't mean it in that way, but it's a good example of where the system isn't working well. So and not taking into account women's gender-specific needs, and we know that so many women experience domestic violence and abuse. But there are a few other examples we have where women's needs aren't being taken into account. So, for example, this one isn't necessarily just about women, but we've seen women being tagged to a homeless, and then they don't have an address to go to. So there's an example of a woman who was tagged, she was homeless, and she couldn't charge her tag, of course, because she's got nowhere to live. It ran out of battery, she was recalled to court, and the judge rejected her claim that she was homeless for a reason of the battery running out, and she was recalled to prison. There's an example I'm sure you've seen in the news, Gay Delap, who wasn't able to wear a tag on her ankle because of medical reasons. So then suggested that she wears a tag on her wrist, but her wrist was too small. So then she was recalled to prison because the tag didn't fit. It was no fault of her own. So there's quite a few examples that we have through the work that we do with women where the system isn't set up to address and meet their needs. If you think about a tag, it's the wrong size. Gay Delap isn't the only woman that would be wearing a tag in the community. So I think there are definitely real challenges and gaps that we see in what's happening at the moment.
How widespread is that problem with tags not fitting women?
It's not the first time we've seen it, and we've worked with another woman who couldn't wear a tag on her ankle just because of medical reasons, and that just wasn't taken into account. And I don't have it to
And tags are quite imperfect. You get a lot of recall where the tag's not picking up, and the person gets recalled because of that. So the statistics on recall are they're quite clear. So July to September of last year, 73% of recalls were for non-compliance. 35% for failure to keep in touch. And that one is really loaded because there can be automatic calls to numbers, and if you don't pick that up, that's your failure to keep in touch. 24% for further offending, 23% for failure to reside. That would include being bailed to an unsafe place to live. And we had a 42% increase in recalls in that period on the year before. And they've been greatly exacerbated by fixed-term recall, statutory instrument, and the early custody scheme that we had last year to reduce capacity. So, it's very similar to what we talked about with remand. It's about how you assess risk, because we consistently talk to probation about this, and they consistently say all recalls are made on risk. And I think that there's that judgment, that fear that you will be the probation officer that will not recall someone who commits a serious further offence.
But it's fair to say we've seen significant rises, really big rises in the number of people who have been recalled over recent years. And that, there is something not working in that system. And I think as Anne said, we need to be looking at actually why people are recalled within those categories. What are the reasons for that? And actually what alternatives? Sometimes, we'll see the behaviour and deterioration of behaviour whilst on licence can be because the support isn't there. The person's needs isn't being met. And actually that needs to be looked at before a decision to recall. In cases of kind of non-compliance, etc. So making sure that all that support is in place and other alternatives have been looked at as well before recall. Recall can have a huge impact on people's lives. Families can fall apart. We've seen examples of that, and so it needs to be for a reason.
I just support that in terms of the numbers. The last decade, the number of people in prison on recall has more than doubled, up to 5260 in 2014, which has now gone up to 12,199 in 2024. And the MOJ stats say that will expected to go up by a further 13%, even more. So it's a big driver of overcrowding in prisons. And the other point to mention about probation services is their workload is increased significantly, and the kind of correlation between workload and recall is also significant. Our submission for the sentencing review is said to seriously look at the short fixed term recalls, which are less that should be abolished, in fact, and that there should be a sort of comprehensive process to look at recall in the way that it makes it kind of more tied rather than using discretion in the way that it's doing now.
Can I just give one quick example of something about kind of licence conditions? So we were in contact with a man recently who had found a job. He wanted to go to that job. It was shift work. He was on a curfew and he had to leave his house slightly earlier than the curfew was lifted to get to his job. So had that conversation with his probation officer. But it was left really up to him to decide, does he take the risk of being recalled to prison by going to that job? Well, that licence condition is not enabling him to move forward with his life if that's the choice he has to make.
Quick question.
Yes.
How easy is it to change the licensing conditions? So, for example, the gentleman you just referred to, how easy is it for him to go back to either the court or the prison and say, if you can change these hours, I can get a job? Or equally, the lady that Nicola referred to earlier, if she says this home is no longer safe for me, can I change that? So what is that process and how easy is it?
In terms of something like a curfew, it would be for the probation officer to make an application for that to happen. So it would then be decided, I think my understanding is within the probation service, but they have to apply for that change. So it's not the individual. The individual has to have the conversation with the probation officer. They then make that application. So we need,
to the court?
I don't think it's the court. I think it's the probation service. The decision happens within the probation service, as I understand it.
Community offender manager.
Yeah.
Thank you.
I think we've sort of covered the goal around reducing the number of women in prison. The review of women in custody and the Youth Justice Board were announced last year, and both are due to complete shortly. In light of these reviews, what is your view on the future of youth justice policy?
Do you mean the review of girls in custody? Is that the...
Yes.
Yeah. So, I think I mentioned earlier that we are quite hopeful about the outcomes of the review of girls. It feels like the review's got a handle on the issues, and particularly this issue of some of the girls that aren't being accommodated in secure children's homes. Some girls are in secure children's homes, but there are a number that aren't. And our view is that they all should be. So we're quite hopeful about that. In terms
Could you tell us how many girls there are in custody at the moment? And
I think it's 13. I'm looking at my team.
How many?
I think it's 13. It fluctuates. 1-3, yes. So it's a really, really small number of girls.
I think you said they were all in secure children's homes except for one? Or
it's one in the secure school. Yeah. And there's some, as I understand it, in the secure training centre at the moment. But don't take that as the absolute figures.
Of that order, yeah. Okay.
And in terms of the future direction of the Youth Justice Board, we've been engaging with the review. I think we and our members are really keen to see that the independence of the Youth Justice Board maintained. One of the things that's really important from our perspective is that currently, within the current departmental divisions of responsibility, the Youth Justice Board is the only bit of the system that is focused on children, whereas the rest of the system focuses on adults and children as sort of an adjunct to that. So that the fact that the Youth Justice Board is there to really champion what's going on for children and their rights and their needs is really important. And I'd also say that I think the successes that the Youth Justice Board has had over previous years, particularly around decarceration and around Child First, we probably wouldn't have seen if the Youth Justice Board hadn't been independent and was part of the civil service. For the former, there was a level of risk appetite that was needed. And for the latter, there's a real sense of actually the knowledge and expertise that the Youth Justice Board has and who it's staffed by is really important. But I would say that in recent years, I think the Youth Justice Board has maybe struggled with some of the systemic and structural issues, particularly things like racial disproportionality and how we get a handle on that. And there's a sense maybe that it's lost its teeth to some extent, and we see a lot of activity that's about shining a light on good practice and good case studies, but possibly little less of, and what does that mean, and so what, and really clear guidance for how actually we then do something about that, as well as maybe less public-facing voice around some of those issues. They're all things that we have already fed into the review of the Youth Justice Board, and we'll obviously see where their recommendations go.
Thank you very much. Well, I'm going to end this afternoon's session there just by thanking our witnesses for your time, particularly for staying over time. You've shared an extraordinary amount with us. It's very helpful. It's the first session. It's quite a long inquiry. If there are further thoughts you have, I think you mentioned one or two things you're going to send to us, that would be helpful as well. But for this afternoon, just thank you and to thank the members of the committee and the Secretariat, and we'll draw this session to a close. Order.